We're back for another edition of the Vandy Program, and my guest today is Tom Shanahan. We're going to talk about college football, and we're also going to talk about college football in the context of the 60s and race relations and a whole bunch of stuff that Tom has uncovered, some of the myths that are out there, some of the things that have happened that we haven't heard about. Tom, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. There are a lot of names that deserve better place in history, and it's a sports journalism failure, and I'm happy to have the chance to discuss it.
Yeah, let's dive in. I guess the first question that I've got is, can you give us sort of a 30,000 foot overview of who you are, what you've done, and what brought you to where you are today?
Okay, well, I grew up in Michigan, and my dad was a professor at Ferris State University, which is the reigning NCAA Division II champion, where Trinidad Chambliss, the Ole Miss quarterback, is from. And so when we moved there is when Michigan State had their 65 and 66 national title team. So I was always a Michigan State fan. And there's only one school I applied to. And once I got accepted at Michigan State, I didn't go anywhere else. I've always loved history. I've always loved writing. Graduated from Michigan State. We worked out in the San Diego area at suburban papers and then got on at the San Diego Union Tribune. And that's been most of my career. And then, of course, the newspaper industry declined, and I came back to the Raleigh-Durham area, and I was working for an internet company called College Game Day, and we were ahead of the technology, sending scores and stories to your phone, and then we were quickly passed up. But I was at the age where, I was able to kind of semi-retire. And something that had always been in the back of my mind as a kid was there was something different about the Michigan State team because they had so many black players. But being an elementary school kid, you can't really understand it. But the thing that stood out the most to me was that Michigan State had a black quarterback, Jimmy Ray. Nobody had black quarterbacks back in those days. And when I was working in San Diego, I got to know Jimmy Ray was Michigan State's quarterback. He rode the Underground Railroad, Duffy Daugherty, from the segregated South, came from Fayetteville, North Carolina, when they still had segregation. A lot of kids today, black and white alike, they don't realize segregation is recent history, not ancient. So anyways, I always knew about Jimmy Ray and his pioneering role, and I got to know his son, Jimmy Ray, actually the third, who was a vice president with the Chargers, and now he's with the Cleveland Browns. And I told Jimmy, I said, I don't think the story of Duffy Daugherty and the Underground Railroad and college football integration has ever been properly told because I didn't quite understand it. I knew there had to be a lot deeper story. And he hooked me up with his dad, and Jimmy Ray was happy to tell the story and connect me with teammates. And so that's what I've been doing for a decade now. And you'd think I'd be running out of untold stories. And I just sent you one recently, Dave, about Johnny Roland, who desegregated on three levels: Texas high school football, Missouri, playing for Dan Devine, a Duffy Daugherty disciple, and then when he was hired by the Green Bay Packers as an assistant coach by Dan Devine, the year before, the 1973 season, there were only three black assistant coaches in a 26-team league. So you could see how far we've come. And a lot of times I wonder to myself, how did we ever get this far? There was so much racism and prejudice and Jim Crow. You wonder how we ever got this far.
Yeah, let's start with Duffy Daugherty because one of the things when you and I started corresponding, I was digging into kind of the Bear Bryant stories and some of the other segregated South stories that are maybe more well known. But Duffy Daugherty, outside of I'm a Gen Xer, so I know of him through stories. And I grew up by Notre Dame, so I know of the rivalry that they had in the 1966 game of the century and all that fun stuff. but I don't know much about Duffy Daugherty or about Michigan State's role in all of this. So, how did how did Duffy become kind of the guy who, as you mentioned a bit ago, is really played a very key role in desegregating college football?
This is where the sports journalism failure comes in. Duffy and his teams, Duffy had the first fully integrated rosters in the 1960s, and by that I mean double digit black players. He was into the 20s by the time they played Notre Dame in the game of the century. The rest of the country was following kind of an unwritten quota where they didn't want more than a half dozen black players. You look at all the team pictures from the past, and there's very few black players. Um, and that includes USC. USC only had five black players on its 1962 national championship team and only seven on its 1967 national championship team. But one of them was O.J. Simpson, and then Mike Garrett was on the 65 team. And since they were scoring all the touchdowns, there was this misperception they had a lot of black players, but they didn't. And think about it. Los Angeles, home of Jackie Robinson, Pasadena, the diversity, the population, you got to work hard to keep your numbers down to 5 and 7. So that was the trend. And in the sports media of the 60s, and this obviously changed with the 1968 Mexico City Olympics and Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and then you had Muhammad Ali, of course. But for the most part, in team sports in the 1960s, the sports media avoided race. It was the elephant in the room. They didn't want to talk about it. And this goes all the way back to Jackie Robinson. You can look at the stories of when Jackie Robinson broke the Major League Baseball color line in 1947. They barely mention it in some stories, and some stories don't mention it at all. And that's because the sports media, part of it was institutional lazy sports writers. Part of it was they were complying with the fear that advertisers and subscribers wouldn't like it. And then, as the great Shirley Povich of the Washington Post said about the Major League Baseball color line and why there wasn't more written about it, he was afraid a lot of the white writers agreed with it. So I think you had the same thing going on at Michigan State and in college football in general, but particularly at Michigan State, because Duffy Daugherty teams were setting all these milestones. They were establishing them, and it was running a parallel track with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So people that were paying attention, it may not have been written about, it may not have been talked about in the games, but you had Southern schools starting to comply with the Brown v. Board education in 1954. They were finally getting around to it in the 1960s. Wake Forest in 1964 desegregated. Houston with Warren McVeigh and Bill Yeoman, a Duffy Daugherty former assistant coaches. So step by step, these schools and these individuals were breaking ground, but it wasn't in the consciousness of the public. It was a void. So then what happened is 20 years after the 1970 USC Alabama game was played, some USC backers made up this myth that Bear Bryant scheduled USC as a game to lose in 1970 at Legion Field in Birmingham because he wanted to shock his fans, his bigoted fans, into allowing him to recruit black players. And so and Sam Cunningham ran all over Alabama. It ignores so many things. First of all, Michigan State was the first fully integrated team to play in the South, and that was in 1964 against North Carolina at segregated Chapel Hill. And then I mentioned you had Wake Forest desegregated in 1964, Houston desegregated in 1964, Southern Methodist with Jerry Levias in 1965. These teams were playing, these were black athletes playing in Southern stadiums. It was nothing new by 1970 to see a black athlete at a Southern stadium. You had Kentucky in 1966. You had Tennessee in 1967. By the 1970 season, and the USC people who made up this myth 2 decades after the game was played, they didn't understand all the progress that had happened in the 60s because it wasn't in the media. It wasn't part of college football lore. So they made up the story and they backed in the Sam Cunningham story to fill a void of blank pages in the history books. And it ignored all the things that I told you before, but it also ignored this. In 1969, at Legion Field in Birmingham, Tennessee, which desegregated in 1967, went to routed Alabama 41-14. That was 1 year before USC arrived. Jackie Walker, Tennessee's black linebacker, intercepted a pass in the first quarter and returned it for a touchdown, 21-0. He was the first black man to score at Legion Field. That wasn't shocking. That wasn't enough shock for the Alabama fans. But the people who made up the myth at USC didn't understand this, and they got away with it because Bear Bryant is a legend. People don't want to know that Bear Bryant was the seventh of 10 SEC coaches to recruit his first black player. He wasn't the first. He wasn't a groundbreaker, a crusader. And by the 1970 season, 33 of 37 major Southern programs had a black player. They might have only had one or two, but they had one. It was nothing shocking about what USC did. And so when I started spelling all this out in my books and then later my website, I couldn't get any traction. And I began to realize this because everyone in college football lore accepts this 1970 Bear Bryant fairy tale, and they're afraid to challenge the Bear Bryant myth. And I break it down this way. A third of the sports media believes the Bear Bryant myth. A third of them know it's not true. And this includes Alabama writers that I've talked to. But they won't write anything about what I've written or they won't put me on their show. And a third of them know the Bear Bryant myths are not true. And the other third are younger writers that they don't know that segregation is recent history. And maybe they're told by older writers what Bear Bryant did. They're just completely in the fog. They don't know. So that's where we're at. College football lore does not understand. And my point is, it's an injustice to the Wake Forest players, Bob Grant, Houston's Warren McVeigh, Southern Methodist's Jerry Levias, Kentucky's Nat Northington, Greg Page, Wilbur Hackett, Houston Hawk, Tennessee's Lester McLean, Jackie Walker, and the Duffy Daugherty, all his 1960s players that were enlightening the rest of the country, and the coaching tree of guys like Dan Devine and Bill Yeoman and Sonny Grandelius and Bob Devaney, who followed Duffy's blueprint. And that's my mission, to try to get this story understood as the most important part.
That one of the things that I read of yours that was really interesting was, and I'm going to get the dates wrong on this, but there was a time when it was going to be USC. So this predates. I think this predates the 1970 game. So it was UCLA against USC, and the winner would go to the Rose Bowl. But there was a lot of jockeying for position in the background. This was the year that Ohio State's faculty voted to deny the team a Rose Bowl berth if offered. And Alabama was spending several months lobbying to try to get into the Rose Bowl. Tell me how all that unfolded.
Yeah, this is another Bear Bryant myth that's misunderstood, and college football lore has spun it in Bear Bryant's favor, and almost none of it is true. I heard a lot of these stories growing up as a writer, and I didn't know any different. But as I began to research it, here's what happened. So the 1961 season, UCLA won the Pac-8. Actually, it was called the Athletic Association of Western Universities back then. And there had been a recruiting scandal, and the conference was reduced to about 4 or 5, 6 schools. And so there was a lapse in the contract with the Rose Bowl and the Big Ten that dated to 1947. The exclusive deal that the Big Ten would come there, and the commissioner of I'm going to just call it the Pac-8 for simplicity. The commissioner was a guy named Tom Hamilton, and he and Bear Bryant were buddies from the Navy. And so Tom Hamilton, uh, it's hard to imagine in today's college football world, he had the right to pick who would face the Pac-8 champion because of this lapse in the Big Ten contract. So he and Bear Bryant were scheming behind the scenes to get the invitation at the expense of the Big Ten champion. And the way this has been spun, Jim Murray, the great Los Angeles Times sports writer, Pulitzer Prize winner, he had heard about how UCLA had 8 black football players at the time, and he had heard about how they threatened to boycott the game if Alabama got in the back door. And so he went to Alabama a week or two before Alabama was to play Auburn and clinch their SEC title, #1 ranking, and then the bowl bids start getting handed out. And he went there and he confronted Bear Bryant. What are you going to do about if the UCLA black players boycott the game? And Bear Bryant said, "I'll have no opinion, and neither will the university." That never gets reported in the story. The only thing that gets reported is that poor old Bear Bryant, uh, he couldn't get to go back to the Rose Bowl because he went there as a player with Alabama. And that's mean old Jim Murray, shattered his dream. That's the way it was spun because Ohio State at the same time, and the secret, I won first place for a story from the Football Writers Association of America. And I spell out the chronology. You can go to my website, tomshanahan.report, and read it. The way the story was spun was that Ohio State turned down its invitation, and then Alabama was going to be invited. That's not what happened. Alabama was jockeying behind the scenes the entire time because Bear Bryant had the support of the commissioner, Tom Hamilton. And then what happened was Ohio State clinched the Big Ten, and then afterward, the Ohio State faculty, this is another thing that's changed dramatically about college football. They had the power over the athletic department. And there was a professor at Ohio State that was concerned that Woody Hayes was turning Ohio State into a football factory. So he was quite prescient on that. And he was able to convince enough faculty members to vote with him, and they declined the invitation to the Rose Bowl. And there was actually a riot in Columbus from the students until they got some Ohio State football players to come out, talk to the students, and tell them to go home. Well, then, so the door is wide open for Alabama to step right in. But Jim Murray was writing his columns, so then there started to be some resistance. The Alabama president began to realize this is going to be ugly. If we go out to Pasadena, and there weren't very many black students at UCLA, but there were some, and they were going to boycott too, demonstrated the game. And if there's no black, and the story is that the black players from UCLA aren't going to play, because this is in May of 1961 is when you had the Freedom Bus riders, when the KKK and white supremacists were bombing buses, uh, pulling them over and setting off firebombs. So and I spoke to Kerman Alexander, who was a UCLA star at the time, and he went on and had a long NFL career, and he was the one that told me that the UCLA black players decided, hey, if we can't play at Alabama, why should they be able to play at our stadium? Although we're talking about the Rose Bowl, not the Coliseum where they played in those days. And that was their stance, and it's a reasonable one, because you're in Los Angeles, you're not in the Jim Crow South. And so I think the Rose Bowl started to get cold feet. The Alabama president started to realize this was going to blow up in their face, and the Alabama president came out and said, "We're going to the Sugar Bowl." And so then the Big Ten and the Ohio State was already out of the picture. So then Minnesota was allowed to come. Minnesota had finished second to Ohio State, and even though they had been in the Rose Bowl the previous year, they were allowed to come again because the Big Ten back in those days had a no repeat rule. So that was what happened. It wasn't that Bear Bryant got told to go home by Jim Murray. He got told to go home by the Rose Bowl, Tom Hamilton, and the Alabama president. But the story is that poor Bear Bryant didn't get to coach in the Rose Bowl. And here's the other point I want to make on it. Bear Bryant didn't care about black kids. Uh, he was seeing the ugliness of racism, the firebombing of those freedom riders in May, and the only thing he cared about, he didn't care about the potential black boycott that Jim Murray mentioned to him. He just wanted to take his team to Alabama, and if you read some of the books, there's one of the books, and I cited in my story. They say it was disingenuous for Jim Murray to go to Alabama and write this story about how Alabama shouldn't be allowed to play in the Rose Bowl. What is disingenuous about being the only sports writer in the country to confront Bear Bryant on his own turf? I mean, Jim, if there should be a revote on the 1961 Pulitzer Prize, it goes to Jim Murray. That is a completely misunderstood story. The rest of the sports media, ever since then, has been afraid of the Bear Bryant miss, and with the exception, I'll throw in one exception, and that's Hal Raines, the former New York Times executive editor, who was from Alabama. And in the HBO film about the 1970 USC Alabama game, which has a lot of misleading information, Hal Raines says, talking about how Bear Bryant finally decided to desegregate or his fans were going to get him fired. Hal Raines says, Bear Bryant didn't have a boss. And that story I told you about, the 1961 interview with Jim Murray, where he said, and the university won't have a comment either. That sums it all up right there.
Do you think, Tom, that later on in his career, we're getting a little bit of an echo, but we'll try to sally forth. Do you think that Bear Bryant later on in his career came around?
No. And here's why. This is a good point you're bringing up. I already gave you the background on how these USC guys made up this story 2 decades after the 1970 USC Alabama game. There was nothing in the media about, we had this landmark game. USC's integrated team came down to Alabama and they opened all these eyes. Nobody wrote a word about it. And in fact, in 1978, when USC returned to Legion Field, there wasn't a single retrospective story talking about how USC broke all this ground when they came the last time they came to Alabama. That's standard journalism. You go back and read the stories. There isn't a single word about it. Keith Jackson broadcast the game. He never mentioned a single word about a transformative racial moment in the broadcast, play by play. I've listened to the whole game, and nobody mentioned Sam Cunningham as being the hero of the game and opening eyes. Keith Jackson said that he had a couple of touchdowns, but he didn't mention him in the context he was a transformative figure. But here's why I say Bear Bryant never learned his lesson and didn't care. In his book in 1974, so by then he's had integrated teams, and this is one point I failed to mention. In 1970, the myth is that USC opened Bear Bryant's eyes and got permission to recruit black athletes once Sam Cunningham ran over Alabama in 1970. Bear Bryant already had his first black player on the roster, Wilbur Jackson. He was a freshman, but freshmen weren't eligible that year. And he had actually signed two black players, Wilbur Jackson and Bo Matthews. Bo Matthews ended up at Colorado, which is another condemning unknown Bear Bryant story that we can get into later. So you, Bryant had been sued by the African American Student Association in 1969 for failing to recruit black athletes. The campus, remember, was desegregated in 1963. Bryant didn't recruit a black player until he had one on his a freshman in 1970. So I forgot to point that out. That's another contradiction to this whole Bear Bryant myth. So in 1974, Bear Bryant comes out with his book. It is written by John Underwood, Sports Illustrated, great writer. And he tells a story about how he was at a Chicago airport the day George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door and tried to block the desegregation of the Alabama campus with Vivian Malone and James Hood. And then he had to back away and they were admitted. This is 1963. And Bryant tells a story in the book that he was having lunch and he gave a generous, because he was waiting for his connecting flight in Chicago to go to a clinic he was going in Montana. And he said he left a generous tip. And he's walking towards his gate, and the waiter chased him down, gave him his money, said, "I don't want your money," because he knew what was going on down in Alabama. Bryant, instead of that opening his eyes, in the book, 1974, in the book, he laughs and said, "Well, if he wants to cut off his nose, no skin off my nose, you know." And he thought it was funny. And the other thing that amazes me about that is John Underwood didn't say, "Hey, wait a minute. This does not sound good, Barrett. This makes you sound tone deaf." And here's another story that's in that 1974 book. He talks about how Michigan State and Notre Dame were ranked 1-2 all year leading up to the game of the century. Alabama was also undefeated, and they complained, and they finished number 3 in the voting. And they complained that it was reverse racism. Bryant stoked that people were voting against Alabama because they were all white. Never mind that they won a share of the 64 national title and a share of the 65 national title. Where was the racism then? So anyways, he's telling this story about how he was trying to overcome the reverse racism. And he had, I think it was an equipment manager, Alabama, a black guy, and he told him to put on this red jacket and to stand by him the entire game against Auburn in 1966, last regular season game. Because he said this is in the book. This is from his own words. He says, "I knew that TV cameras would be on me a lot, and so I wanted him to stand next to me so people could see, we're nice to black people." He tells a story without ever realizing why don't you just recruit a black player? Why don't you desegregate? It was the law of the land. And again, he's completely tone deaf. He doesn't understand that at all. So no, Bear Bryant, he never understood until he started losing games, and he realized he had to recruit black players to win games. And here's the other. Let me finish this one more point, and I'll let you ask another question. Here's the other thing that people don't understand about Bear Bryant, and that he started recruiting black players to win games. Well, Bear Bryant had won throughout the 60s with smaller, quicker players. But with the end of platoon football, starting in the 1964 season, now you could have big defensive players that only had to play half the game. Before, you wanted smaller players because they couldn't play 60 minutes. So Notre Dame and Michigan State were two of the biggest teams in college football in the 66 season. In 1966, Alabama's All-American offensive tackle was Cecil Dowdy, 6'1", 202 pounds. And I always say this when people try to tell me that Alabama got screwed over in the voting. If they played Michigan State, who was going to block Bubba Smith, 6'7", 280? Who was going to block George Webster, also in the College Football Hall of Fame, 6'5", 240? If they played Notre Dame, who was going to block Alan Page, College Football Hall of Fame and Pro Football Hall of Fame, 6'3", 240? Who was going to block Jim Lynch, linebacker, also in the College Football Hall of Fame, long career with the Chiefs, and he was like 6'2", 225, something like that. It would have been a complete mismatch. But nobody ever takes that into account. They take Bear Bryant's word as gospel. The modern sports media is afraid of Bear Bryant and all his myths. They don't want to challenge him.
And as you mentioned, those players and their sizes, it's interesting to think about um, how small that seems compared to what we've got.
Yeah.
What we've got
Clinton
today.
Jones, Michigan State's College Football Hall of Fame running back. He was bigger than Cecil Dowdy. And not as tall. They're about the same height, but he weighed more. They would have just ran all over him. Jerry West was a Michigan State offensive, All-American offensive tackle. And he said, I asked him about how would Alabama ever block Bubba and George. And he said, if you got low on Bubba, you might be able to slow him down, but you weren't going to block him. And then he said, forget about trying to block George Webster. George Webster. You couldn't block him. And this is the other thing that people don't know. This is the other thing that I try to bring out in my books, Ray of Light and The Right Thing to Do. Bubba Smith is the most famous Michigan State player because there'd never been anyone like him in college football. 6'7", 280 with the speed of a running back. He's the most famous. George Webster is the greatest Spartan. That's undisputed among Biggie Munn, the athletic director, Duffy Daugherty, the coach, and all the teammates from those teams. George Webster was the greatest player. And then Jimmy Ray is the most socially significant as a black quarterback when there were no black quarterbacks. And then he went on to and then he was a pioneering black coach hired by Duffy Daugherty. And then he moved on to the NFL. And he was the second black coordinator in the league when the Rams hired him in 1983 as an offensive coordinator. Remember I told you a story about Johnny Roland. There were only 3 black assistant coaches in a 26-team league in 1973. Jimmy made the jump to 49ers in 1977, 28-team league. He was one of only 10 black assistant coaches. So anytime you hear people talking about how black coaches don't get their fair chance, they don't understand history.
What else do you think we need to know about the post Jim Crow South and segregation, desegregation, and integration that we're not talking about or we haven't heard about?
Well, all the milestones that were established but not recognized properly, and that allowed the USC myth to overtake the story. By the way, Bear Bryant never took credit for that 1970 game. That was the other thing I didn't mention about his book. In his 1974 book, there is not a single word about the 1970 game. Not in any context. Not that they got beaten badly, 42-21. Nothing about the score, and then certainly nothing about it being a transformative racial moment. And John Underwood, he's passed away since then too. He was asked about how come you didn't write about the 1970 USC Alabama game in your book. And Underwood said, subject never came up. It's because nobody was talking about it until the USC guys made up the myth. And because Bear Bryant is such a legend, nobody wants to believe that he was dragging his feet. He was one of the last guys. He was at the back of the line. He wasn't at the front. Everybody wants to believe he was a hero. And so the story just exploded. And one time I was on a Zoom call with other writers from the National Sports Media Association with Ken Burns. Ken was promoting his Muhammad Ali documentary, and he took questions. And I mentioned to Ken, because Ken had talked about myths that you have to untangle when you're researching. And one of the questions I was able to ask Ken, I told him, I've come up with all this great research about Duffy Daugherty leading the way and all these great pioneers that resisted Jim Crow, had their lives threatened. Jerry Levias, the FBI deemed a death threat against him in 1966 as credible. And Warren McVeigh had a death threat against him when he played at Ole Miss in, I think, 1965, might be 1966. So all these guys, they put their lives on the line. And I asked Ken Burns, how come I can't get any traction? I've got all these just incredible stories about brave people, and the only story that is told by the modern sports media, ESPN, Sports Illustrated, The Athletic, everybody, The Atlantic magazine just in May wrote a story giving Alabama and USC credit and Bear Bryant just in May, and it's all wrong. But anyways, I said to Ken, how come I can't get any traction? And Ken said, in Americans like their stories tied up into a nice little bow. Bear Bryant waved a wand, and that was the end of segregation. Jim Crow was over one night. As I often write, name any time in American history where we solved our racial problems in one night. It doesn't happen that way. It's always a long struggle. And as I mentioned, all these other names, Warren McVeigh, Jerry Levias, they did all the dirty work. And Sam Cunningham gets all the credit, Bear Bryant. And let me add this too. Sam Cunningham later came to realize he had been used as a pawn to sell that myth. And he, because he later learned from Bob Grant, who was a pioneering black player at Wake Forest in 1964, and a guy named Reggie Berry, who played at Long Beach State and with the Chargers, because Reggie Berry had this education program for underprivileged schools in the Los Angeles area, where he got athletes together and he talked to kids about the importance of education. And two of them were Bob Grant and Sam Cunningham. And I got to give you a little more background on Bob Grant first here. Bob Grant was from North Carolina, and his plan was to ride the Underground Railroad to Michigan State in 1964 with Jimmy Ray. They were friends. They went to different high schools, but they knew each other from playing against each other. Black high schools, of course, segregation in 1964. And he was excited to go to Michigan State. Duffy Daugherty had a commitment from him. And then Wake Forest decides it's time for them to desegregate. Bill Tate was their coach. He had been a player and an assistant at Illinois. And when the Wake Forest president said, I want to desegregate, what do you think? Bill Tate said, I'm all for it. He had played with black players in high school and college, and then he had coached them. It was no big deal to him. So Bob Grant's high school coach calls him into his office and says, tells him about what Wake Forest wants to do, and they want you to come there. And Bob Grant told him, he said, why would I go to Wake Forest? Because the previous year they only won one game. He said, why would I go to Wake Forest? I'm going to go to Michigan State and win a national title. And his coach, and remember, this is a different time, the most important, influential person in recruiting in those days was the high school coach. There were no recruiting services back in those days. And Bob Grant had so much respect for his high school coach when the coach said, Bob, I think you can go to Wake Forest and you can open doors for future black kids. And so Bob Grant did what his coach wanted him to do. His mother, when he told his parents, his mother told him, I don't want you to go to Wake Forest. Those white boys are going to kill you in your sleep some night. And that was not outrageous. The KKK was around in North Carolina just like it was in Alabama, and people were lynched back in those days. And Bob Grant's father said, no, you go there and conduct yourself with pride and a leader, and they'll come to respect you, and you can make a difference. Bob Grant was the first black player from a major Southern Conference team to make all conference. In 1966 at Wake Forest, he made the All ACC team. He was the first black player from a major conference to be drafted in the NFL, Southern Conference, major Southern Conference, to be drafted in the NFL in 1968 by the Baltimore Colts. He won a Super Bowl ring. This is an incredible story. Nobody knows it. They only know Sam Cunningham. And uh, so, so that was my point about Bob Grant and going to all the things that he had been through, and he lives in the shadow of Sam Cunningham. Uh, and so, anyways, so Bob Grant, Sam Cunningham, Reggie Bear, they're all talking one day after they had one of their meetings, and Reggie Berry says to Sam Cunningham, says, you guys didn't desegregate the South with that 1970 game. And Sam, this is all quotes from Reggie Berry. You can find him in my book, The Right Thing to Do. And Reggie Berry told him about Bob Grant, 1964, Warren McVeigh at Houston, Jerry Levias. Told him about all these guys. And he said, Sam Cunningham went silent. And he thought about it. And he later told him, he says, no, you're probably right. And he had realized that he had been used by USC's backers, making up this myth, embellishing their own poor integration history while trying to sell a movie script that was failed. It didn't sell because the producer, the studio owners began to realize this 1970 USC myth doesn't add up. There's a lot of problems with it, especially with the story about Bear Bryant taking Sam Cunningham into the locker room at Alabama. That never happened, but that's the story you always hear. So, anyways, uh, so my point is, getting back to your question, Americans want a story tied up in a little bow, and everybody spread that word of mouth. Sam Cunningham ran over all those white guys, and Bear Bryant tricked his bigoted fans into letting them recruit black players. That's an easy story to repeat and tell and laugh about. How do you tell about Duffy Daugherty, what he did with his teams throughout the 60s? And then he had an underground railroad of black high school coaches calling him up and saying, I've got a player for you. The chief engineer of the Underground Railroad being Bubba Smith's father, Willie Ray Smith, who won 235 games and 2 black state titles as a Texas high school coach during segregation. And he said, take my son Bubba, and while you're at it, take this guy Gene Washington. We've been playing against him for 3 years in football, basketball, and track, and he's killing us. Gene Washington also went to Michigan State, and he's in the College Football Hall of Fame. These black coaches trusted Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty because they had seen them on TV in the 1954 and 1956 Rose Bowls, and they'd seen the number of black players on their team. And back then, the two most watched games, the NFL was inferior to the college football as far as TV was concerned in popularity back then. And the two most popular games, TV ratings, were the Army-Navy game and the Rose Bowl. So the entire country saw what was going on at Michigan State, but it wasn't being reported. So how do you? So you got to tell this Duffy Daugherty story. You got to tell this Wake Forest story. You got to tell this Houston story. You got to tell the Southern Methodist story. It all gets lost. The easier story to tell is about Sam Cunningham and Bear Bryant, and HBO, Showtime, ESPN. They've all been fooled. They fell for it hook, line, and sinker. They still promote it to this day. I've sent emails to ESPN editors about this, Sports Illustrated, The Athletic, and they're all afraid to take on Bear Bryant because they don't respond. Um, and like I told you, there's a couple of Alabama writers I've talked to about this, media types, and they told me you've got it right, but they won't tell my end of the story. They don't want to challenge Bear Bryant.
Tom, where can we find your work online?
Go to my website, tomshanahan.report. I have links on there to my books, Ray of Light and The Right Thing to Do. By the way, quoted on the page 1 of The Right Thing to Do is Barry Switzer saying, nobody did more for college football integration than Duffy Daugherty. Barry Switzer loved Duffy Daugherty, and this is also a major part of Duffy's coaching tree. Barry Switzer was an assistant coach at Oklahoma under a guy named Jim Tatum, along with Chuck Fairbanks. Chuck had played for Duffy Daugherty, and then he coached for on Dan Devine's staff at Arizona State. Dan Devine recruited more black players than he inherited. Then he went to Houston and coached on Bill Yeoman's staff. Bill Yeoman desegregated Houston. These are all Duffy Daugherty's assistant coaches. So then Chuck Fairbanks gets the job at Oklahoma as an assistant coach. Jim Tatum dies shortly after spring football of a heart attack, sudden death. He was a young guy. And so all of a sudden, football season's coming up. Oklahoma needs a new coach. And Chuck Fairbanks gets promoted. Oh, again, the unwritten quota, only a half dozen black players. Oklahoma didn't desegregate until 1956. They had a half dozen or so by the mid-60s. But Chuck Fairbanks wanted to recruit more black players. And Barry Switzer, even though he came from segregated Arkansas, he was of the same mindset because he had grown up with black kids in his neighborhood in high school. He writes about it in his book. And Barry Switzer told me this story because Chuck Fairbanks has passed on. Barry Switzer said that he and Chuck were of the same mindset. They were going to recruit the best player. They didn't care if they were black. Well, and they had success. And in the 1971 game of the century is Chuck Fairbanks, Duffy Daugherty disciple, coaching Oklahoma with a fully integrated roster against Nebraska. Bob Devaney, Chuck, former Duffy Daugherty assistant from his coaching tree, coaching Nebraska. And so the 1966 game of the century was the first time, there's a half dozen games with the label of a game of the century. 66 one was the first one with black players. Michigan State had 20 black players, 11 black starters, 2 black team captains, George Webster and Clinton Jones, both in the College Football Hall of Fame, voted by a predominantly white roster. Remember, there were only 20, but that was 15 more than everybody else in the country. And then Jimmy Ray as the South's first black quarterback to win a national title. And then Notre Dame had 1 black player, Alan Page. So people saw that on TV. Nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote about it. Chris Schenkel was the play-by-play man for ABC. He mentioned Bubba Smith was from Beaumont, Texas. But he never said a word about Duffy Daugherty's Underground Railroad and how this Michigan State roster differed from everybody else in the country. And then Dan Jenkins, everyone from my generation's hero, godfather of sports writer. He covered the game for Sports Illustrated. His only description of Jimmy Ray, there was only 2 black quarterbacks in the entire country in major college football. Here's Jimmy Ray leading Michigan State. He was on the 65 team that won the national title, and here he is as the starter on the 66 team in the game of the century. His only description of Jimmy Ray was he had a mustache. Not a word about him being a transformative figure as a black quarterback. In fact, I can go on and on. This is another fact. I mentioned about the milestones Duffy's teams were setting that were never reported, never established. So as I wrote Ray of Light, which is mostly about the 65 and 66 teams, and Jimmy Ray's role as not only a black quarterback, but going on to coaching, Jimmy had told me the story about how, he's living in segregated North Carolina, and he figures he's probably going to play at an HBCU. Black kids back then, they couldn't think about going to the Big Ten. So he's watching the Rose Bowl. And back then, they introduced players. They ran out of the tunnel, they stopped, and they froze, and the camera pictured them. And there was Sandy Stevens, Minnesota's quarterback. He's black. Jimmy didn't know he was black. And that was the first time he started thinking, hey, maybe I can get to a Big Ten school. And Sandy Stevens, who was from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, is recognized as the first black quarterback to win a national title on that 1960 Minnesota team. And so Jimmy's telling me all this story, and I already know there's no black quarterbacks in the 1960s. It's not going to take a lot of research. If Sandy Stevens is the first black quarterback to win the national title, Jimmy might be the first black quarterback from the South to win the national title. And sure enough, I came up with that conclusion. I presented it to Jimmy. It's the first time he'd ever heard it. Nobody ever reported it back when he played. And so I ran it by the National Football Foundation, Phil Marwell, and they put it in a newsletter. They confirmed it. They said, "You're right." They put it in a newsletter. So now that's part of Jimmy Ray's history, but it wasn't for 40 years. So um, my point being, all these moments, all this history are lost to history because it's too hard to explain, and it's too easy to just repeat this Bear Bryant myth. Nobody wants to challenge the Bear Bryant myth, and almost none of it is true. You remember I want to tell another story. Um, you remember the stories I told you about his book in 1974, where Bear Bryant reveals on his own how tone deaf he was, that he was behind the times. Uh, he was sued in 1969 by the Alabama African American Student Association, and so this lawsuit went away. And he signed Wilbur Jackson and Bo Matthews to a Southeastern Conference letter of intent, and in those days it was in December. So they signed in December. The game, of course, against USC wasn't until 1970, and until September 1970. So the Alabama has this high school all-star game that's annually played at Tuscaloosa at Bryant Denny Stadium. Back then it was just Denny Stadium, and Bryant would come around and meet all the players. And this is just a couple of weeks before fall camp is supposed to start. And he comes along, and the whoever's escorting Bryant says, "This is Bo Matthews. He's coming to your school." And Bo Matthews never talked about this because he was so embarrassed. He was so ashamed um, until I think I'm the first one that he's really told the story to. It's on my website, tomshanahan.report. Just Google Bo Matthews and Tom Shanahan. And Bear Bryant barely recognized him. Didn't say a word to him, hardly at all. And Bo Matthews said, that should have been my red flag. Because a few days later, an assistant coach, not Bear Bryant, the grandfatherly figure that he is portrayed as, an assistant coach told him, "Bear wants you to go to a junior college because of your grades. He doesn't want you to report." And then Bo Matthews said he was just devastated because he had told everybody, "I'm going to Alabama." He was so proud of it. It's another contradictory thing. If you're a black kid, you're not allowed to go to Alabama because of segregation and Jim Crow. But because Alabama's so famous, they're still excited to go. It doesn't really add up, but that's the way things were. So, anyways, to make a long story short, the entire time, Colorado had been trying to recruit Bo Matthews because they played in the Liberty Bowl, and they made some contacts in the South, and they heard about Bo Matthews, and they came and visited him in Huntsville, Alabama, and but he was committed to Alabama, and so when this all fell apart, Colorado got back in touch with him, and they had a special program for minority students to give them a chance because remember, Jim Crow, the black schools weren't as good as the other schools. They didn't have the resources. They had a lot of dedicated, great teachers, but the emphasis on education wasn't the same as it was for a lot of kids. So Bo had been working the whole time at a hardware store in Huntsville, and the owner of the hardware store, he was told the story about how he can go to Colorado, they'll admit him, but he can't play on the team because he's a non-qualifier and he can't have a scholarship. So the hardware store owner, a white guy, paid for Bo Matthews' first year of college. Bo got his grades up, was eligible for a scholarship as a sophomore, and of course had a great career at Colorado and played in the NFL. Can you imagine? Bear Bryant treated Bo Matthews that way. Just left him out, hung him out to dry. Didn't even talk to him to explain to him, "Hey, well, go to a junior college, improve your grade, come back." Didn't even talk to him. And in fact, Bo Matthews' high school coach said one of the reasons he turned to Colorado was his high school coach, a white guy, was upset at Bear Bryant too for doing that to his player. And he said, I don't think you should go to a JC. What if you get hurt? If you've got a chance to go to Colorado, go there. And that's what happened. None of these stories are told. None of them. They're too hard. People don't want to hear Bear Bryant, the ugly side of Bear Bryant. So it's really a sad story. It's an injustice. It's not just that Bear Bryant is not who people think he was. And it's not just that the 1970 USC Alabama game wasn't what people think it is. It's the injustice to all these guys who opened the door to make it possible for that 1970 USC Alabama game to be even scheduled. And I want to say one more thing about USC. They made up this myth to present themselves as this model integration program, and they were not. I already told you about how they followed the unlimited quota restrictions until the late 60s. And then they did have 18 black players on that 1970 USC roster that played at Alabama. And that's what the Atlantic article in May focused on. Oh, see how USC was ahead of the game? I did the research on this. 11 of those 18 were junior college and college transfers in either 1969 or 1970. So, in other words, they were in single digits until John McKay finally caught up to the rest of college football. And because they were shedding their quota years, there were only 4 black starters in that 1970 USC Alabama game. So this myth that USC looked like Grambling, it's not true. And Sam Cunningham, he was running behind holes opened by 5 white offensive linemen. Sam Cunningham even says, they were gigantic holes. All I did was run through them. One more point about Sam Cunningham. In 2016, he sat for an interview with the LA Times. It's published. It's in the LA Times. You can look it up. And remember I told you the story about how Reggie Berry and Bob Grant enlightened him about all the things that happened in the 60s. And Sam Cunningham told the Los Angeles Times reporter, said they made that 1970 USC game in. They added all the sauce to it. They made it more than it was. So he knew he had been used as a pawn. But when Sam Cunningham died, it was a front page story everywhere. ESPN, New York Times, everywhere. Bob Grant, a guy who did the dirty work, nothing. Not a single headline outside of my website or the Winston-Salem Journal where Wake Forest is.
Tom Shanahan, you are doing incredible work telling these stories, and it's much appreciated. I'm sure a lot of people don't know all of this, and this is really doing a ton to help dispel some of those myths.
Yeah, because ESPN and Sports Illustrated and The Athletic, they keep feeding it to the public. They're lazy, and they just Bear Bryant's a legend. We can't say anything bad about it.
Well, Tom, thank you for coming on the program. Much appreciated. And we'll have to do this again at some point, maybe after this season is done, and hopefully some of these stories continue to get out there. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity to tell them. I hope people will listen. And then this year is the 60th anniversary of the 1966 game of the century. Michigan State will play at Notre Dame on September 19th. And if you go to my website, I have a series. I've got 4 parts recorded so far of Michigan State and Notre Dame players talking about that game.
Awesome. Tom, thanks.